Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly, and voila! You get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. With me today, I have a fascinating topic with a fascinating guest, Ruth Thomas from Curo Comp. Hello, Ruth. How are you?
Hi, David. Nice to meet you.
So Ruth started her career as a graduate trainee at a retail bank in England. Can you tell us how that kind of led to where you are today?
Yeah, quite a different world away. I've been an HR lifer, as you would say, specializing in reward probably for the last 20 years of my career. But my interest in technology, which is where I am focused today, and what Curo Comp is all about, really even began at those early stages of my career. I think one of my first graduate placements was on a project where we were collecting the requirements for a big HRMS system. And then my first live HR role, where I actually got to go and look after my own group of employees, was actually in the IT division of the bank. So back then, it was all about mainframe computers. I used to have to recruit cleaners for the two massive computer rooms in the bank's data centers. But, it's definitely, the world has changed a lot since then. But, I kind of moved internationally, focused more on reward, and landed back in London probably around to the beginning of the millennium, the 2000. And that was really when the advent of Saas technology was taking off in HR. And it was really fascinating. I worked on systems like flexible benefits systems, implementing them. They were really the first, Saas products that we saw with a lot of traction in HR. I think it was my frustration at not being able to find a compensation management solution that did everything I wanted to do that led us to eventually found Curo Comp. And that was really all about, looking at how you could use SaaS technology to transform traditional approaches to reward, and very much thinking about driving fair pay as well. And since then, really been focused at Curo Comp for the last 9 years on helping to shape our product portfolio, and the last 3 years focusing very much on pay equity.
Both topics around my heart. And so we're going to get into that a lot today. But one fun thing that you might not know about Ruth is that she's slightly numerically dyslexic. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was the one I was prepared to disclose. So, fun fact, I was prepared to disclose. Yeah, inherited from my father, who was a musician. Apparently, it's quite common in musicians. But I do struggle, comparing numbers, which is slightly ironic, bearing in mind, I was a head of rewards in an investment bank like yourself, and was probably counting quite a lot of dollars in bonus pools over the years. But hey ho, I survived and I'm still here today. So.
Well, actually, I think a lot of us feel slightly numerically dyslexic, especially when we fat finger numbers on keypads when we're trying to make a frantic call. So yeah. I'm there with you, Ruth. So today's topic is fascinating because it's one that gets at the heart of a lot of issues that we're dealing with today, like pay equity, which is pay transparency. And I know I'm passionate about this, and I know you're passionate about this, and I know we're going to get into this a lot, but pay transparency is an amazing topic, and I'm surprised it's not getting more traction in press or in the thought leadership angles on the HR world.
I don't know about you, but I don't know very many people that are hopeful about the world of work. And I'd like to change that. My name's Marcus Mossberger, and I started the Hope at Work podcast, where you'll find two things. Number one, really interesting guests. And number two, innovative ideas about the future of work. Check it out.
Well, I think the pandemic may have put a bit of a break, a foot brake on that. It was very much becoming much talked about after the last recession that we had, after the financial crisis. I think then we saw all the frustration around bankers' pay and, since then a lot of negative wage inflation. And employees, I think, were generally demanding more transparency around pay because they felt they weren't necessarily getting a fair deal. And then, since then, we've really had a lot of legislation emerging around, banning pay secrecy. Mm-hmm. And then obviously all the kind of pay equity legislation that we've seen forcing countries to report on pay gap reporting, which is leading to more and more public scrutiny around pay gaps and fair pay and the whole topic of pay transparency.
Right.
And I think other things adding to that, we're definitely living in the information age, which has meant more data is accessible to more people. So you've got sites like Glassdoor and salary.com, which allows employees to draw their own conclusions about pay. There's one of the things they say about pay transparency, if you're not talking about it, you can guarantee your employees are talking about pay.
Sure.
So I think, last year, we actually did see an uptick in transparency between employers and employees during the initial crisis phase of the pandemic, because there was so much going on, there's so much change happening that employers needed to very much communicate openly and directly with their employees. And when you think about what happened to some companies in respect of pay, even managing to affect pay decreases, which is, something I'd never experienced.
Sure.
In my career in reward, but the fact that employees willingly accepted pay decreases meant that there was a lot of open communication going around about pay. So I think now as we move, hopefully start to move out of the pandemic, I think it's important to build on that spirit of trust and affiliation that we did establish during that phase and start to think about, moving back towards this journey of pay transparency.
And so when we think about transparency, one of the fascinating things that I like to think about, especially how pay has evolved as a thought process and a business process is, even if we look at the origins of someone's work at an organization, when they're going to an organization and when they're looking at postings, there used to be an expectation that a salary range was actually listed on the advertisement. And so when you get into a process now where you're interviewing, and I think that's actually gone away, because if you look at listings today, it very rarely actually does have the pay expectations from the employer perspective. And there's almost this implicit kind of cat and mouse game that goes on where the organization asks you, what are your expectations? What do you want to get paid? And in some cases, some municipalities like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has decided that's actually not legal. From a pay equity perspective, it says you can't ask people what their salary history is. Well, they get around that by asking your expectations, but they say that you can't say what your expectations are you can't talk about your history, sorry.
Yeah.
But expectations is still open. And that seems like just a cat and mouse game.
Yeah, and I think one of the objectives of the salary history bans is to stop the perpetuation of the pay inequity that exists in the marketplace.
Exactly.
So if you bring someone in on their existing salary because that's the salary they've had with them for their career, and that's maybe not the hiring rate for the job, but you're the recruiter and you think you've done a great job because you've saved the company, $10,000 because you managed to get them for $10,000 beneath the midpoint for the pay range. But actually what you're doing is you're creating a position of risk because that person is then going to be paid unequally compared to their peers. And that may be an issue that in the future you want to fix. So, I think we're seeing a lot of traction with organizations, particularly on our pay equity software, where they want to establish the fair hiring range. Recruiters want to know the fair hiring range when they're bringing people into the job. And there's much more of a greater understanding of let's not, think we're saving the company money. Let's put people into the right hiring range.
And that actually has translated as well into law here in the U.S. with the Lilly Ledbetter Act, where the inequity can be traced to any of the last few or even the last time that someone was paid. So if you trace back a person who was paid unfairly, and it goes structurally throughout history, a person can sue for those back wages, and because of unfairness and how laws had been created in the past, Ledbetter basically allowed a person to say the last time I was paid is the last time that inequity happened. And so to me, it strikes a chord because there are so many people who are being paid unfairly, and it goes back to the history. And, I don't know if we're going to get into this later on in the conversation, but I wanted to try and get to this now, which is that, people negotiating for their pay need to be careful not to basically say, well, this sounds like it's fair to me from a pay perspective. And I would caution people to say, don't do that. Let the company tell you what the pay is for that job so that you don't establish yourself in that, poor position of them being able to say, this is what I've been paid all along, so I'm okay with it. Allow the company to basically tell you what that pay should be.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to get into those same inequitable situations that Ruth was talking about. And we don't want that. We want you to be paid fairly.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the touch points of pay transparency, is coming into an organization. And I think, people get very scared about what does pay transparency mean? We've read all the stories about those wonderful tech companies where they publicly post everybody's salaries, and you can see everybody's salary from the CEO, downwards. And that's not what pay transparency is. There's definitely a continuum here. And, the one end, you have employers who really don't share any information other than the employee knows exactly what their pay is. The other end is publishing everybody's. But in between, you've got the steps around, definitely sharing information on how pay is determined, which is really important. And then sharing information about salary range data, either with the employee or more broadly across the organization. And I think it's important as an employer to work out, where you sit on that continuum and where you want to be on the continuum in terms of creating an environment of transparency.
So let's talk about that pay transparency that you're talking about, which is the continuum. And on one side, it's complete privacy and complete, I guess you could say, radio silence. And then on the other side is like a Zappos or some of the other case studies that we've heard of in the past, which is complete openness. And, we know everybody from the person who is the trainee all the way up through the CEO. And so there is a lot of cultural, I guess you could say, the culture kind of drives that, right? Where people are. But in the middle, there are a ton of, companies that try and take a traditional approach of having managers have access to certain data and employees not having access to that data or having access to pieces of it. And it comes out eventually, and there is a sharing in some places and not in others. So how does the company strike the right balance of what can fit their culture and where can they go around transparency to be able to become more open, but not have to worry about opening up too much?
Yeah. Well, I think there's sort of three things that are important: culture, values, and history. Now, historically, some larger organizations, their pay practices have built up over a long period of time.
Sure.
And some of that may have inequity built in, that being completely transparent about something may be a very difficult thing to do right away. And so, you wouldn't expect potentially a very large organization with those types of issues, often unionized environments, collective bargaining agreements and things like that, to be in the position to publish everything. But I think what we're seeing increasingly is where organizations talk about trust and openness and transparency as part of their values and how they want to treat employees in the organization, they need to kind of back that up in how they communicate pay within the organization. And it's important to think, there's really, to motivate an employee around pay, there are three key things that the employee wants to know. They want to know how their pay was determined. So how did I end up with the pay that I've got? They want to know how they can advance their pay, and they want to know how they compare to their peers. And there's got to be some element of transparency there for you to be able
Sure.
to meet those three important employee needs.
Mm-hmm. And to me, some of that is certainly cultural, and some of it is also training. So part of the culture of that is that some companies may try and achieve what you're talking about by giving out just enough, not too much, but just enough. And it might be salary ranges. It might be giving job ranges, which are relatively a newer concept given that market pricing is at a more advanced level nowadays, where you can create ranges specifically around jobs. And that still may actually have some bias built into it, but at least it's focused on the position as it stands today. But then talking about how you can establish that for that employee, it also goes to a training component for managers. How do you talk to managers about being able to provide enough information, not too much, but enough information, and not to try and overpromise, because the underdelivery, especially in compensation, leads to dissatisfaction, disengagement, and then potentially getting or losing associates or employees that could be great for your brand or really important for your brand. And so how do you strike that balance of providing training and information to the people who have to or are in the trenches? They are in the trenches, and those are managers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, David, is managers, because often when we work with clients or when I interact with people, on our webinars or in training sessions, what you often hear from them is, we don't trust our managers. We don't want to give them the pay ranges. We don't trust them. And I think we need to move on from that point of view. And our role in HR and in reward is to empower managers and treat them as, what they actually are, which is hopefully sensible business decision makers.
Right.
They can make other decisions, are effective for your business. They should be able to make an effective decision around pay. So, I sometimes think, it is a bit of an excuse from HR reward is like, well, we don't want to share the information with managers. It's about, you need to share it in the right way. You need to train them. And, technology definitely helps here, sharing information via the various different types of compensation technology platforms that are available allows that to be, shared in a more insightful way, so that it's easier to work out, what's the right decision to make from a pay perspective and what's not.
And I think one of the problems has been in history that we've gotten burned by sharing too much with managers and them not having the maturity level and the training to be responsible enough to make decisions that are good for the business. And I agree with you, though. They are the business owners. They are the business leaders. You have to provide them with the right tools in order for them to make the right decision, because ultimately they own their budgets or should be owning their budgets. While we in compensation and in HR leadership might have I guess you could say, a trustee relationship with the board of directors to manage pay in a responsible way, it's up to the business leaders who actually own the budgets for their groups to be able to flex the insights that we give them in order to make the right decisions. I'll give you an example. When we talk about the investment banking world or the banking world in general, and you're talking about a people generating revenue business where you're talking to a head of investment banking, for example, and one desk has a really great year and another one has a really terrible year. And while you want to incentivize performance, that manager says, or that leader says, I need to be able to pay not just the desk that succeeded, but the desk that failed. Because if I don't pay the desk that failed, they're going to go to our competitor, have a great year, and put us to shame, and as well tank our numbers for that year. And so we have to toe a very specific line with them about the risk and reward of pay for performance, for example, and be able to provide them with enough, not too much, but enough of a budget to be able to make whatever decisions they have to make. But you get to these exceptions that go outside of rules, and they, first of all, kill your overall budget, but second of all, reduce to rubble your pay for performance arguments. And I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you, since you worked in banking as well for a lot of your career, is how do we overcome that issue of having to pay for not just the performance, which is easier to pay for because there's evidence there, but not only pay for that, but pay for skills and pay for potential? How do you get those two things in the same budget with budgets the way they are in 2020 or 2021 now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, if you look back to that time when you and I were both actively working in reward, as you say, a lot of it was about making decisions that maintained the franchise as much as paid for performance that year.
Yeah.
As you say, that's not that much different to how we look at using reward today, because if you think about how organizations are also changing their purpose from being wholly profit focused, to being multi-stakeholder focused. And a lot of the time we used to talk about reward needs to focus revenue generation, whereas now reward needs to be focused on achieving business priorities. And there are a lot of things that go into achieving business priorities other than just revenue. And some of those business priorities will be around, how the organization contributes to the wider world, and how the organization treats its employees and its customers and its supply chain from an equality perspective, and a whole host of other, business priorities. So it's making it more complex. Compensation is definitely more complex, and I think, that's where, my focus has obviously been on how you can use technology to help make better informed compensation decisions. And there are so many great things you can do with technology around, controlling managers' behavior. So if they try to enter a particular pay recommendation, you can give them all sorts of warnings. You can give them prompts. You can give them nudges. You can have hard stops. You can focus on how they can spend or can't spend their budget. All that stuff we couldn't do in a spreadsheet, which you and I have been using, 10 years ago. The technology today is getting better and better in terms of being able to support decision makers and control the effectiveness of their decisions.
And so one of the things I want to pull out from what you just said, which is awesome, which is you're creating an incentive structure which focuses on other goals other than just revenue. And it focuses on a bunch of different things, which then get measured. And those measurements go into that incentive calculation algorithm, however you want to call it, and then come out with a recommendation that then is going towards the budget that is fed from a larger pool of money, which gets created based on not just revenue, but on other things. And I think it's fascinating that, in the past, we may have had one or two things for goals for these revenue earners. But now, and I especially remember this during the banking crisis, there were risk components that were built into bonus calculations, which said that, riskier bets were negative on your incentive. So we were pushing people to make the right decisions for the right reasons, not making the right decisions for the wrong reasons. And so now we have these incentive formulas that take other things into account, which should be driving different behaviors. Comes back, though, to the ability to measure those things and provide that feedback on a regular basis, not just the once a year timeframe, but on a regular basis. So throughout an entire incentive period, whether that's a quarter or a year, people are getting the right feedback. The measurements that we're using inside their incentives, inside their incentive pools, are being given to them so that they can understand where they are on their incentive earning potential, and can they change their behaviors, can they change the outcomes so that by the end of the measurement period for the incentive, they're on target for getting the kind of payout that they want based on the behaviors that they're getting in the algorithm.
Yeah, and I think, again, that to support that transparency journey, which is what you're talking about there, is from, when someone's had their goals and priorities set that are going to drive their pay through the performance year, whatever period you're using, to judge that. The managers need to be able to understand how employees are performing against those objectives, and the employees too. So again, great compensation technology will have employees have access. They can see and monitor how they're doing. And, even better, comp technology allows employees to model and their own potential payout. So if I performed like this,
Yes.
my incentive pay could potentially be that. So it's having that conversation of openness, if we're talking about, incentive pay, transparency, about having line of sight as to what I've achieved and then what I could achieve if I did this. And that's, really where you get a good link between employee performance, understanding, and motivation.
Have you seen other industries other than just the finance industry that have gone to that level of not just transparency, but that level of algorithm where they're breaking the I guess you could say bonus decision into various components, not just things like we want to incentivize you for company performance and business performance and personal performance. That kind of stuff has happened in management incentive programs for a while. But have we gone past that and now gone to like more of we want to make sure that you're focusing on the pay equity and focusing on internal equity and focusing on what we're doing well from basically a environmental perspective? Have you seen companies doing that well?
Yeah, definitely across most sectors now. I mean, we support a lot of professional service clients on our software, and from the legal and sort of advisory services. It used to be all about the hours you charged, and that was how you derived what your bonus was going to be, for example.
Right.
But now that, as you say, there are a lot more broader corporate metrics that are being used to be included in how overall, your incentive pay will be awarded. And then for some reason, we have quite a lot of customers in the project engineering space, and that's where they are moving multiple projects during the year. I think it's because our particular compensation software is very good at supporting quite advanced proration calculations. So, we're able to track people as they move on projects throughout the year, and they'll have different goals associated with each period of a project. And then all of that computes up to, what someone might receive as a payout during their year-end process. So I think much more common now is this. And it was, as you say, a lot of that came out of the last recession where, yes, all the regulatory stuff around reward did originate in the financial sector, but that good practice did spread across many sectors where, people wanted to see a much clearer line of sight between what was being paid out as an incentive pay and the overall performance of a company.
So could we say that people who are participating in those types of plans are better consumers of incentive pay because now they're smarter about the measurements that the companies are using to generate that pay? And the measurements have led to a more openness about how all of those payouts work. And therefore, the better consumer of the incentive pay and the company who's providing them the measurements have a better understanding about where they are throughout the entire process. And therefore, they are better partners in pay as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's that whole, when I've talked about what are some of the key factors that drive transparency in the past, I didn't mention at the beginning of our session, but, the whole regulatory environment and the need to enforce that transparency has had a big part to play. It has brought in a lot of good practice more generally around understanding and being able to communicate. So a manager can now understand when an employee says, why was I paid what I'm paid? They have an understanding and the tools in place to be able to explain that.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by Turetsky Consulting and listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So I'm sorry to get a little pedantic, but could there possibly, because in the incentive world, we're further ahead on transparency because of the need, especially from the crises that had occurred, to break down the incentive payment into various components and be measuring along the way. Could we try and set something up that then goes more toward the origin of base pay, which is obviously being paid to more people because more people are on either an hourly wage or they're on, an annual salary? Is there a way that we can create a methodology for companies to be able to create a better understanding about how a wage can get predetermined rather than making it all market-based or basically all salary range-based, which gets derived from the market. Don't you think there's a way we might be able to get there? And I'm specifically talking about not like a job questionnaire like the old point factor systems. I'm basically talking about ways in which we can value skills and experience and other things, other intangibles that enable a company to be able to derive compensation more fairly, that strips out a lot of the gender and ethnicity kinds of more biased functions of pay, and gets more towards the science and the art form of being able to derive a better base salary.
Yeah. And you mentioned the key word you mentioned there in terms of how I see this evolving is skill and skills-based pay. It's a future of reward trend that is being debated. And as we move more and more to a talent market where skills are the most important currency in that market, being able to pay for skills is very different from what we do today, where we tend to pay for the job or we pay for the person.
Sure.
And it's not unheard of to think of a world where, as an employee, I might potentially work for 3 different organizations and I deploy 1 or 2 of my 5 key skills in different combinations across those 3 different organizations, and they're each going to pay for a bit of me, not unlike the gig platforms that we have today. And so it frightens me at the moment about how we're going to be able to calculate that. This is where the power of AI in technology and predictive modeling is going to have to come into play, because if you think market benchmarking at the moment is quite onerous, but having to get to the point where you're benchmarking someone who has multiple skills, who is deploying those in multiple companies, in multiple markets, how do you price the value, of what is the pay that I get? It's going to be quite challenging.
It is, but I think what we've seen, and you mentioned the word gig, and it's kind of overused, but it is true, that the gig world is here. And the fascinating part about this is you could have people who do 3 or 4 different jobs during a day, whether it's, they Uber to get to work, they Uber and bring people in their car to go from one place to another. And then they are on Upwork or some of these other platforms that enable them to get a gig job for a period of time. And then they might be on Fiverr as well to get another job, which takes them throughout the rest of their day. And they're using each of those pieces of their skill catalog to be able to get paid what they think is a living wage and something that they can live on.
Yeah.
And that all, is using those pieces of skills. And, we've been talking about skill-based pay for decades. When I was doing weighted job questionnaires back in the early 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, it was all about being able to understand what's the value of that incremental skill. And, using regression analysis to be able to measure that. Well, we're now in a world where AI and machine learning, to your point, can probably do that on the fly. And the answer is that I'm a little scared because, and I've talked about this on the program a lot, on the podcast a lot, which is that HR data is very dirty. And therefore, when you're trying to measure something in the world of HR, unless the data is more pristine and we can measure those things and measure the contributions based on skills and have an accurate and up-to-date capture of what those skills are, it's going to be very difficult for us to be able to measure that stuff unless we're looking at the gig platforms, which say, I was working on Fiverr today and I got paid $500 for creating a business plan, and I used my marketing background and my business background to be able to do that, and here are the skills underneath that. And so the $500 dollar payment for that 2 hours of work I did, so it was $250 an hour, and here are the skills associated.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we're starting to see that whole concept of the talent marketplace happening within organizations and very much mobilized as a result of the pandemic, where there was suddenly a huge need to have access to certain skills. And, there are great, talent marketplace technology platforms coming into place where organizations are now building their catalog of skills. So I think we're at that early stage of, organizations understanding what skills they have in the organization, what skills they need for success, and then we can start to put the pricing element to it, and that's when I think we'll start to see the skills-based pay evolve. But you mentioned dirty HR data, and I mean ultimately I think a lot of the reason for that is self-declaration. People have not declared their data, but I think if we get to the point where they know their pay is derived from it, they'll ensure their data is clean. So,
Sure.
I mean, most organizations, they'll say the one point of the year they
Right.
know when their data is really clean, when they're processing the annual pay review.
Yeah, that's true. I think, though, that there's got to be the element in the enterprise world of business where they make that changeover and we start to get the Uber inside of the organization. And you're right. I think the pandemic did push that. But I think there's got to be a sea shift, a sea change that we find in an organization that says, I'm not going to be able to hire people, or I shouldn't hire people the way I used to. I can leverage people instead of hiring them, not put restrictive covenants on their comings and goings, but hire them when I need them, get the right people when I need them, and be able to ensure that they can then find another role somewhere else, not restricting them, but facilitating them, and being able to use like the Uber method where you give them 5 stars after they gave you a really great experience, and then they can move on and use that and advertise that for the next company instead of thinking about proprietary skills and using those people in a proprietary way, unless of course they have to because it protects their franchise. But I think that that's something that will evolve, and I think that's again a cultural change that has to happen, and that sea shift to occur. There needs to be the supply and demand element of it before it actually gets there.
Yeah, we can start that journey now by starting to encourage these open discussions about pay in organizations, and creating that environment of transparency so people now understand how their pay is determined. And as we move into that more future state, that journey is already in place.
So Ruth, we talked about what is pay transparency. We talked about some of the cultural issues and maybe some of the practical issues for why pay transparency has not happened and what gets in the way. We also talked about how we can help facilitate, or how business leaders can actually take on a more active role in being part of the pay practices and being able to provide them with insight and information. What else did you want to kind of summarize with before we kind of close?
I think really just focusing on maybe the business case that, I always like to write it as an equation where you've got transparency equals trust equals engagement equals productivity. So when people say to me, how do I persuade transparency in my organization? For me, there's a business case, and that is the clear business case. And I think it really is time now for us to move beyond those aspirations about pay transparency into reality, and start putting some of the principles in action and some of the more practical things that we need to do to get to pay transparency in place, and get ready for that future world that we were talking about earlier when we were talking about, the world of skills-based pay.
And I think that world provides a lot of opportunity for equity. When pay is transparent, there's a breakdown in the way in which you can pay people differently because of who they are, instead of paying them for what they are in terms of their skills and what they bring and their impact to the business. And that's ultimately where hopefully business wants to get to, which is paying people fairly based on their productivity and based on their impact to business, right?
Yeah, pay people for the value they bring to the organization.
Exactly.
Don't pay people on their pay history.
Thank you. Very well said. Ruth, it was a fascinating and interesting and engaging conversation. I appreciate your time.
It was very nice to be with you today. It was great to have a good chat. So
hopefully we can get together again and be able to talk about something else in the world of people data, people analytics, and pay.
That would be great.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And please, if you like the podcast, please hit the subscribe button. And if there's someone you think might value from the podcast, please forward it to them. We would appreciate it. If you have any comments, please make any comments you have on the podcast page on turetskyconsulting.com/podcast. And I appreciate your time. Please, thank you very much, and stay safe.
That was HR Data Labs. Please visit turetskyconsulting.com/podcast to review the show, add comments about this episode, or add new ideas about upcoming shows you'd like to hear. Feel free to be creative, but please be nice. Thank you for joining us this week on the HR Data Labs podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.